I was recently talking to my nephew about this school field trip of his that's coming up. I guess he's going to be visiting a farm in the state over. Well, that got me thinking about all of the field trips I had as a kid, particularly the ones from grade school. I started talking about the state aquarium and the zoo and the airplane museum we visited when I was a little too young to care about it, unfortunately. But none of it seemed to pique my nephew's interest. Yeah, well, I went on. What else? Oh, we went to that tongue museum once. Let's see, what else? My eyes glanced over to my nephew, who was now looking away from his phone for the first time all evening and staring at me with a strange look on his face. What? I asked. The tongue museum? I've never heard of that before. Where is it? Oh, it's, I began, but was then forced to pause. I know they took our class there on one of the school buses, and I remember it taking quite a little while to get there. But as to where it was, I couldn't say I knew. I'm not sure, I said. What did they have there? Just tongues? My nephew asked, with a look on his face that was either disgust or stifled hilarity. We both started to laugh. Well, let's see here. It's been quite a while since I've even thought about the place, and it was well over a couple decades ago. But yeah, I think it was mostly tongues. I remember the gift shop had a wall filled with lollipops shaped like tongues of all sizes and different animals. I specifically remember this pig tongue sucker they had that was the size of a dinner plate, and it was red. Kinda creeped me out. My mind wandered off as I spoke, and I found myself staring at the ground before my feet as images and long-lost memories began to swirl around my skull. For a moment, I almost questioned if any of this actually happened, or if all of this was somehow a dream or a delusion I dreamt up without realizing. But as the recollections continued passing my mind's eye, I became utterly convinced that this did, in fact, happen. It was around then that my brother walked through the front door. Sorry, went a little late tonight, he said. Hey, you weren't too much of a handful for your uncle, now were you? He asked, as he threw the fast food bag down on the front coffee table. My nephew shook his head, but then immediately brought his attention to the subject at hand. Did you go to the tongue museum too? My brother's eyebrows shot up to the top of his skull, and he started laughing hysterically for just a second before suddenly regaining composure and declaring, No, I think I would have remembered that. Why? The teachers find a better place to scar you with? Now, my nephew was going to a farm for the field trip, and his dad was worried they might bring him into some of the more, brutal, you could say, areas of the place, but I told him I don't think the school would have allowed that anyway. Uncle Dave says he went as a kid. My brother turned my way, looking very suspicious of me. Oh, I see, he said with a wink. Well, I'm sure that was very educational. I could tell he thought I was pulling the kid's leg. I'm serious, John, I said, trying to keep as serious a face as possible. My class, we went to this tongue museum as a kid. So you're telling me you never went? He stopped taking off his shoes and looked me straight in the eye. No, Dave, I've never even heard of the Tongue Museum, let alone visit it. Are you serious or what? I'm dead serious, man, really. I can tell you about it if you want. I haven't thought about it in years, but I can think aloud. Both my brother and his son nodded, and I closed my eyes to try and recall, and staring into the empty void behind my closed eyelids, that's when the images began to appear. I think I was in the 4th grade when we went. I remember pulling into the large, open, empty parking lot when it was still too early for the sun. Must have been 5 a.m. at the earliest. The building itself was like a big pink and purple spire erected in the middle of this giant parking lot, a giant construction in the loose shape of a tongue. To get inside, we all had to walk through a slightly smaller but still very huge papier-mâché tongue in the opening entryway where you'd buy your tickets to get in. But after you buy the tickets, the guy directed us to the right to walk through this doorway that was blocked off in a wall of flowing yellow slime. You see, there was a chute just above the door where the water flowed out, and the ground just below was made of a metal grate, the slick and viscous liquid draining straight through, although a good deal of splashing was definitely occurring. The teacher, Mr. McCoy, turned to the front desk worker and asked if this was some kind of a joke. The guy, looking like some teenager who didn't even care about the job to begin with, told our teacher that that was the only way into the exhibit, and, by the way, there were no refunds, so if we weren't going to enter, we were out of luck. My teacher looked like he wanted to strangle the guy, but eventually he turned around and said, well, all right, everyone, if you have a jacket, just pull it over your heads and hold your breath and run through real quick. Now, one at a time now, all right? I remember being pretty creeped out by the stuff. I absolutely hated getting soaked. And when I got near it, it reeked of a very specific smell I don't think I've ever smelled before or since. It was kind of like sewage, but also a bit yeasty, maybe? I don't know, it was really hard to place. I ran through just like everyone else. By the time we all made it past the check-in area, my entire class was dripping with this sticky goo. Our teacher was absolutely irate. It's been so long since this field trip took place. So, I'm not going to be able to recite the entire chain of events, and it's very possible I'll remember certain events out of order. But I know that after we walked through that doorway, we ended up in this long, dark hallway with a glass case on one side that had a sign hanging from the ceiling just above that read, "Tongues of the World." There were about 50 or so tongues propped up on sticks in the glass cases, ranging in variety and size from a giraffe tongue to a gorilla tongue, to a kangaroo tongue, to a bear tongue, and so on and so forth. I remember hesitating as I walked forward to take a look at the exhibit. After getting up close to what I think was the bobcat tongue, and getting a good look at it, something felt really, uncomfortable about what I was seeing. And no, it wasn't the fact that I was looking at an exhibit of severed tongues. I stared as I tried to place it, and then it suddenly hit me. They all looked fresh, like alive almost. They were moist and glistening, but not in an embalmed kind of a way. but more like it was just cut off the body moments before we arrived and struck up in the exhibit with a stick for our personal enjoyment. Just as this thought occurred to me, our teacher was nagging us to get a move on, that there were many more exhibits to get to, and that if we didn't move quick, there wouldn't be nearly enough time. As we all hustled along, I remember looking around and talking to some of the other kids. I don't remember specific conversations or anything, but we were all a little wigged out. Definitely wished we hit the petting zoo instead. As I told my nephew and brother about all of this, I could tell they were both getting a little creeped out and not itching to say a word in the least. They were good listeners now, clearly curious about the situation. I turned my eyes back to the floor and tried to recall where we went next. I was drawing a blank until suddenly a thought shot into my mind like a thunderbolt, and I almost jumped out of my chair. "Oh my God," I spoke, suddenly almost out of breath. "Hey, you okay?" my brother asked, leaning a bit closer in his chair. "Yeah, I'm okay. I hadn't thought about this in so long, but I used to think about this a lot. How had I not remembered? How is that possible?" Odd things occurred in that museum. One oddity that occurred would haunt me for quite a few years after the fact, though I think it was suppressed initially for some time, and after resurfacing, it seems I succeeded in suppressing it quite wholly, though I just wrecked that accomplishment. No, it was all too clear in my mind now, and the longer I stewed, the more disturbed I became. I don't really remember how we ended up in this place, but at one point I found myself in this small room with this other kid. I think his name was Joey. What's particularly odd about this initial recollection is that I don't recall this room, which was no bigger than a small closet, mind you, having a door. There was no way in, and I have no idea how either of us got in there. It's like we just popped into the room somehow. However, there may not have been a way into that room, but there was most certainly a way out. Though the room was, in its essence, just a little navy blue painted box with a small incandescent light bulb hanging from the ceiling, that wasn't all it was. There was in fact one cavity in the wall. Joey and I were staring at it, at the opening portal of a tube slide. Like one of those huge amusement park slides you'd go down as a kid that twists and turns all around with all of those little plastic porthole windows on the sides. It was almost identical to one of those, except for the bottom half of the tube. The part you'd sit and slide down on, which was shaped like a large tongue. There was another oddity about the slide. Peering down into the cavernous entryway, it was utter darkness, all enveloping black, just 6 inches beyond the entry point. There was no way of telling how long the slide went or where it went. Just thinking about it now brings a cold sweat to my brow. Well, for reasons not known, Joey kept trying to get me to go down that slide. He said we'd go together, me first, and then he'd jump on down behind me. I remember taking a step forward to peer down the tube, and staring into that abyss just made me feel so sick. I just couldn't imagine committing to that slide without any reassurance of where it'd take me. It was just too scary, and I outright refused. Joey kept on trying to get me to go down, eventually resorting to name-calling and the likes. When he finally began to understand that there was no way I was going down that slide willingly, he got real silent, and after a few moments, declared that he was going to go down the slide alone. I recall freaking out at this, trying to talk him out of it and telling him this could be a big, big mistake, but he didn't seem to care. In fact, he acted like I was being the biggest wuss in the world for not wanting to slide down with him. I held my breath as I watched him take his sneakers off, and then he sat down at the entry of the slide. He turned to look at me and said, "All right, I'll yell up when I reach the bottom so you can finally grow a pair and get on seeing the rest of the exhibits." I wanted to argue with him, but instead I just nodded my head slowly, biting my tongue. For a moment, he almost looked like he was hesitant. But then, in the time it takes to snap your fingers, he was off and down the tube. The moment he went off, he began screaming in excitement, like the kind of shrieks you'd hear at an amusement park, the sound getting slowly softer and softer as he was carried further and further away from me. This continued for about 15 seconds before his voice was suddenly cut off and silenced, along with an extremely loud, metallic thwack sound, like a boulder had just hit a metal roof. I held my breath, trying to hear the faintest of noises. I crawled closer to the slide's entry. "Joey?" I called out after about 30 seconds, and waited in the silence. "Joey, hello? Are you okay?" But there was no response. I remember the feeling of staring down into that dark tongue of a slide, breathless, feeling butterflies in my stomach, hoping for any kind of response that would let me know he was okay. But as I stared into the emptiness of my mind's eye, waiting for the next events to replay, that never occurred. I don't recall any events relating to the slide after that. In fact, the next thing I knew, I was back with my class, walking, wandering the halls of this museum again. I remember thinking about Joey for a few moments, being somewhat worried about him, but nothing near the level of fear I felt back in that little room. And then I just moved on. Must have gotten caught up in the hurriness my teacher was pushing us through. In thinking back on it, I'm pretty sure I never did see him the rest of the trip. And then I think Joey moved to another state not long after that. In fact, now that I think about it, I don't really remember seeing him when we got back to the school that night, or any day after. It was around this point in the recollection that I noticed my brother was looking pretty uneasy. Our eyes met, and then his started over to his son. Well. "All right, Jacob, time to get to bed. Got that field trip tomorrow." Jacob, who was definitely listening to the story eagerly, wasn't happy about this. But after some intense prodding from his dad, he pretty quickly meandered up the stairs and into bed. Obviously not happy, but whatever. When the door upstairs slammed shut, my brother almost immediately spoke. "Are you trying to give my kid nightmares? Is this your idea of a good joke?" I stood up from my chair immediately and held out my hands in protest. "John, I'm being completely serious. I know your kid had problems with scary stories in the past, and to be honest, if I'd remembered how weird this got at the beginning, I wouldn't have started talking about it. You gotta understand, this is all coming back to me, and I haven't thought about any of this stuff in a long time now. I'm talking decades, John, decades. I'm sorry if I upset you or your kid, alright?" John looked me up and down, and then nodded. "Yeah, alright. I'm sorry. I believe what you're saying, but my God, Dave. I'm just gonna let you know this is quite hard to believe that it actually happened, you know. I mean, forget the fact I've never heard of this before. You've never talked to me about this before. This is also really one of the creepiest things I've ever heard." John walked into the kitchen as he spoke. I heard him open the refrigerator. Well, you want anything to drink? I've got water and some cola." It was those words that opened another door in my mind. I suddenly found myself back in that museum, but no longer in the halls. I was in the cafeteria. No thank you. I tried to speak through the haze of recollection. When my brother returned, I went off rambling almost immediately. I remember standing in line at the kitchen. We were all holding these little styrofoam trays, and I recall being quite hungry. Arriving so early, we didn't eat breakfast, and I feel like we'd already been in the museum for quite a few hours at that point. It was taking a really long time to move through the line. It was like it took each kid 5 minutes just to get their food, and with limited time and a long line of hungry kids, that wasn't gonna cut it. Everyone was getting real cranky. But as I finally got closer to the buffet-style area where you'd grab your food, I suddenly realized why it was taking so long. Looking at the 3-layered shelving of food, one thing was for certain. There was not much variety. The top shelf was labeled gourmet and contained a pile of what looked like chunks of raw, bloody meat wrapped in cling wrap. I reached up and took one in my hand. Moving it around before my eyes, it became clear that I was holding a severed tongue. Placing it back with trembling hands, my eyes turned to the next shelf down, labeled common. The items here looked relatively similar to the top shelf, except more uniformly shaped, each piece about the same size and shaped roughly like a ball. I picked one up and, after squishing it in my hand a little, it felt like I was holding a wrapped up clump of raw ground meat. I must have squished a little too hard because when I placed it back, my hand was dripping with red liquid. I braced as a horrid chill ran down my spine as I turned my eyes to the only shelf left, the bottom shelf, which read, imitation. The food items here weren't wrapped up in cling wrap like the others, but it was still quite a sight. They looked like mass-produced packaged products, like chip bags and whatnot. But the plastic was clear, and inside were these bright pink and red masses shaped like a human tongue. Trying to stay positive and trying to acknowledge my growling gut, I picked one up and brought it to my eyes. It looked kind of like a gummy candy that hardened in a tongue mold. I turned the package around to find an ingredients listing, which read as follows. Ingredients: gelatin, artificial tongue flavoring. That was it. Those were the ingredients. After looking back at the long line behind me and everyone else waiting to get their pick of these delightful treats, I just put the imitation tongue back on the shelf and walked out of the line, tossing my styrofoam tray in the trash. Not many kids picked anything up to eat, but the ones who did looked like they were having quite a tough time getting it down. I watched this one kid trying to tear through his tongue with his teeth for about 3 minutes before he gave up and tossed it in the trash. Watching a kid who got the imitation tongue. He took one bite, chewed it up, and then just left it on the table as he ran to the bathroom. I imagine he didn't enjoy it too much. Soon enough, we were wandering the halls again, following my teacher. At some point, we passed a window where I realized the sun was already setting outside. I remember being amazed, wondering how that was possible given how early we'd shown up. And that was also when I realized that I had to take a leak pretty bad. So I asked my teacher if I could use the restroom, which he said was fine. I had to go so bad I didn't even ask him if he knew where the bathroom was, and I just ran off down one of the hallways. I ran for quite a while, but no luck finding a hallway. I took a few twists and turns, getting more and more worried and more uncomfortable with each passing second, before I almost laughed in joy at the sight of a bathroom sign hanging above one of the doors to the side. Just before I walked in, there was a slight hesitation as I considered the possibility of something unpleasant hiding behind that door. But after rolling it around in my mind for a second, and feeling as though I was about to have an accident right then and there, I took a deep breath and rammed my way through the door. That was when I discovered that I was in a perfectly normal restroom, 2 stalls and 4 urinals. I was so relieved and ran to take care of business. Finishing up in the bathroom, I decided that instead of running back to my group like I'd done all the way to the bathroom, I could just stroll along and really take my time, enjoying whatever exhibits and the things I saw on the way back. Well, this turned out to be a little bit of a mistake, because it took me probably 10 minutes to realize that I was completely lost and had no idea where my class was at all. I began speed walking down various hallways, taking all sorts of twists and turns, ignoring every exhibit and attraction I'd pass in search of my group. I began to run and shout out for my class in desperate, futile attempts. But then, as I turned another corner, I noticed just down the hall and to the side, this gigantic red velvet curtain hung up on the side of the hallway, nearly reaching all the way up to the ceiling. It was an extraordinarily large, incredibly expensive-looking piece of drapery that almost seemed to glow, even amongst these shadowed halls. I walked up slowly, my previous frenzy coming to a sudden halt, and ran my hand along the fabric. It was incredibly smooth, like silk. Pushing my hand forward, I realized there was no wall behind this curtain. There was some opening behind. I bent down and slowly lifted the curtain above my head and peered inside. What I saw took me a few moments to really process, and even then I don't think I really got what I was seeing until after I was already running away as fast as I possibly could. It was as though I was staring through the entrance into a gigantic factory, one of those the size of a football stadium or larger, littered and utterly cluttered with machinery. This machinery was affixed with an assortment of blades and saws connected to one another with these large but fairly skinny conveyor belts. There were windows built into the immensely high ceiling that revealed the sight that really took my breath away. Hung from the towering ceiling on meat hooks were a variety of tongues, most of them the size of a small car, scattered and littering the entire ceiling, fading off into the distance of the fog of the ginormous building. God, there must have been hundreds of them at least, and what looked like clear slime muddied with streaks of red dripped and leaked onto the floor from the disgusting severed ends of the unfortunate organs. The longer I stared into this space, the more freaked out I became, and before I knew it, I found myself sprinting through the hallways of the museum, away from that curtain at full speed. After about a minute of sprinting, as I turned another corner, I just so happened to run straight into my group as they were looking at a large painting of a dissected rat tongue. I was very winded and freaked out, and to make it worse, hardly anyone there even seemed to notice me. But as I finally caught my breath to speak, I began ranting and raving at the teacher about what I saw, about the gigantic factory, the blades, the meat hooks. It was as my eyes lifted up to meet Mr. McCoy's that I realized he looked very confused and almost annoyed. I instantly stopped talking, to which my teacher began, "Davy, I know all that. We already visited the farm." He then patted me on the head and said, "All right, class, let's get a move on." I was confused, but silenced, and then we all got on the move. I was utterly confused, and I might even go as far as to say distraught. By then, I was more than ready for this trip to come to a close. I started asking the other kids if they knew when we were going to leave, but none of them were any help. But almost like he read my mind, or perhaps I read his, Mr. McCoy turned around and announced, "All right, everyone, we're gearing down to head back to school soon, so I want you all to make sure you didn't lose anything. And for the final exhibit, we'll be taking a look at the on-site petting zoo. Right this way," he said, and immediately turned around and began walking. The next thing I knew, we were all standing in this little room surrounded by 4 gray walls. However, one wall was not like the others. There was one side of the room that was painted a darker shade of gray than the other three, almost black, really, littered with about 30 holes of various diameters all about. I remember staring at these holes, wondering how long we had to be here, when before my eyes, a snake began working its way out of one of the holes near the center. I shrieked, as did most of the kids, and we all huddled to the back wall. But the teacher told us to quiet down, that there was nothing to be afraid of. As the thing continued to emerge, I suddenly realized that what I was looking at was not a snake, but was in fact yet another tongue. And as we all watched in horror, one by one, a series of large, shimmering, wet, and slimy tongues slowly wiggled out from each hole, and once emerged about half a foot out, would just stop and sit there, waiting for us to come closer. I looked around at my fellow classmates. Half the class looked confused, and the other half looked horrified. No one wanted to get anywhere near these things. Some of the tongues were shaped and about the size of a dog's, some like cats, and there were a few that looked incredibly human. And about 10 of them were unbelievably large, about the size of a large pillow on its side. I have no idea what animal those tongues were harvested from, and I don't want to know. The seconds ticking away. Apparently our teacher really wanted us to enjoy the petting zoo. "Dave," he said, singling me out. "Why don't you go give that one over there a rub? It looks friendly, I think." I swallowed against my dry throat and nodded, beginning to walk towards that horrid wall of wet, glistening tongues. I found myself standing in front of this particular one that was huge, about as wide as a football. It was like I could see its heart beating through the center of its tongue, a little spot in the middle pulsating every second or so. I lifted my hand and began reaching towards the wet, glistening pad of this monstrous organ. As my fingers met the slippery surface, I pressed my entire palm down against the wet tongue. It was like the presence of my hand sparked the thing's salivary glands, as the tongue almost immediately began dripping a clear, viscous substance. Before, it suddenly retracted back into the wall in an instant, like a turtle pulling its head back into its shell. I let out a small yelp and jumped back, putting aside the disgusting and horrid nature of the exhibit for a moment. The sheer speed with which it scurried away back into the wall was nothing short of nightmarish, completely and utterly unnatural in every way. Impossible, really. But then again, it wasn't the first impossible thing I'd seen that day. It was then I heard my teacher say, "All right, everyone got everything? It's time to head back home." Those words could not have been more welcome, and my mood was given an immediate boost at the thought that I'd be out of here before too long. I tried to rally the other kids together, make sure no one was holding us back or slowing us down, so we could just get out ASAP. But as it turned out, the only way in was also the only way out, which is to say, we had to pass through that disgusting waterfall of slime to reach the outside world again. This time, the teacher didn't even tell us to form a single file line to get through, and Mr. McCoy wasn't complaining about it either. When we were all hesitating to run through the goop, he got a little annoyed and said, "Come on, guys, let's move it. Your parents are going to be worried sick if we don't leave 20 minutes ago, alright? Now seriously, let's go." He was really serious and kind of upset, so we all just kind of ran through in a mad dash. We got absolutely drenched, and so did Mr. McCoy, though, oddly enough, this time around he almost didn't really seem to mind. In fact, he was smiling, his face completely drowned in this gross substance as he made it out and to the other side. He began talking almost immediately, what looked like a giant snot bubble forming and growing larger and larger before splattering all across his own face within the first few seconds of him making it to the other side. "All right, kids, onto the bus. Let's go, let's go, let's go." He was in a real hurry. The bus was right there, parked in the moonlight of the empty parking lot. We all piled on, gooping up the seats real good. Oddly, but thankfully, the bus driver did not seem to mind. He didn't say anything, at least. And then we were driving. And I guess at some point we got back to the school, and then our parents brought us home. As I finished recalling the story out loud, my brother had this look on his face of absolute shock. He took a sip from his glass as he brought his eyes back to mine. "So that's the story, huh?" I raised my eyebrows, a little confused at his attitude. "Yes, that's the story. That's what happened." My brother got up and walked over to the window, staring out at the star-twinkling sky. He then turned back around. I'd be careful who you tell that tale to. I mean, listen, I know you're not nuts or anything, and I believe you're not lying to me, but it's pretty, it's quite an incredible tale, is all I'm trying to say. I nodded and brought my gaze back to the floor. "Well, I should probably get going. You gotta get your sleep anyway, so." "Oh yeah, well, yeah. Thanks for watching Jacob again, and I'll call you tomorrow and we'll find another time for you to watch him." Yeah, good night," I mumbled as the door shut behind me. I stood in the cold, windy night, looking up at the stars and feeling the ghost of that museum in my chest. My God, I thought, is it really true? Am I going crazy? I don't think so, but with how my brother just reacted, God, I wasn't sure. When I got home that night, I laid in bed staring at the ceiling all night. I didn't get a wink of sleep. I just kept seeing that kid Joey slipping on down that tube slide. And then the next morning, I called my mother bright and early. It was probably about 7 a.m., which for me was earlier than I'd ever even be out of bed. But for my mom, it was just another Tuesday. "Hey, Ma, I need to ask you about something." "All right," she responded, almost like she was bracing for something. "I was at John's house last night watching the kid, and I started thinking about old field trips I was on back in school. and I started talking about... I cut myself off as the memory of my brother's reaction to my tale began to play in my mind like a film. My own brother had a hard time taking my story serious, and he was probably about 5 times more open-minded than my mother. How was she to react to all this? Surely she would not respond well. Probably tell me it was a dream like I first thought last night, or worse. She might think I've lost it. Apparently, I'd been sitting in silence for quite a little while because I suddenly realized my mom was talking into my ear. "Davy? Davy, you still there? Hello?" I snapped out of it and went on. Yeah, Mom, I'm here, sorry. I was just thinking about my old school days. You remember that elementary school you and Dad sent me to, right? Yes, of course I do, dear. Is that what you're calling me about? She sounded a little suspicious of me, or maybe she was just concerned. Well, I was thinking about some of my old classmates, Darren and Josh and, Joey. Do you remember Joey? There was a long stretch of silence over the line. After a while, it became my turn to pester the line. Mom? You there? Oh, yes, I'm here, she responded, very nervously, like something was wrong. Now, what makes you want to know about Joey? Know about? Well, I was just thinking about some of my old classmates, and remember hanging out with him and playing video games one time. I just wanted to know if you remembered him, that's all. There was another stretch of silence before she said, Oh, I remember little Joey. Poor little Joey. Poor little Joey. I stood up from my bed, cell phone still pressed against my ear. What do you mean, Ma? I could hear her starting to make strange sounds across the line, like she was trying to hold back sobs of some kind. Oh, son, she began. I never told you about it at the time because it was just too horrible. We all didn't talk about it. It was just too horrible for a young boy like you to have to face. So none of us brought it up for all the kids' sakes. For your safety. I was pacing the room now, wondering what in the world my mom was talking about. What? I don't understand, Ma. Find out about what? Your friend Joey, she began. He didn't move away like we all said he did back then. Son, your poor little Joey was the victim of a horrible, horrible crime. He disappeared one day and his mother rightfully went ballistic, absolutely hysterical. He had gotten on the bus one day, but according to the school, he was never dropped off. It wasn't until many years later that they identified his remains after a fisherman pulled up a small child's shoe on his line. That wouldn't have been odd were it not for the fact that the shoe contained a sock filled with bone. The authorities came out and investigated, identified him, and oh, Davy, I'd never seen a woman so overcome with grief than I did his mother on that day. It was just awful, Davy. Just awful. As my mother's words settled in my skull, I suddenly felt on the verge of passing out and fumbled for my bed just a few feet away. When I caught my breath, I asked, "Bob, did they ever find anything out? Do they have any clue who did it, or?" There was another stretch of silence before my mom gave me a piece of information that made me wish I'd never placed the call to begin with. "Well," she began, no one was ever charged, and there weren't even any leads on the case, but when they found the rest of his remains, I just remember his mother, when she calmed down, describing to me how the police told her whoever had done this was a real depraved mind, and had probably done whatever he did for kicks. His poor mother could barely get the words out, could barely describe the state of the corpse. "Well, did she?" I asked. "Did she describe anything?" She only told me a little, and it was so horrible she could barely get the words out, and immediately burst right back into tears, and I just left it there to comfort her. Davy, his corpse, aside from the horribly rotted and decomposed nature of the thing, was relatively normal. But the reason the cops said what they did is because there was one notable feature of the remains, and it was in the boy's mouth. His tongue was missing. The detectives told his mother that it looked like the thing had been cut clean off with an extraordinarily sharp blade, very far back in the boy's throat. They were sure no animal could have been responsible. It was a deliberate, horrific act, Davy. And I'm sorry, so sorry you had to hear this. I'm sorry I couldn't take this to my grave. I know it's been many decades now, but horrors like this don't simply vanish from the mind. I just hope the images and the thoughts don't haunt your dreams like they have mine.